Thank you for joining me. For those who don't know me yet, my name is Ron Levine from Mindfulness and Blue Jeans. I've been practicing mindfulness and insight meditation for 24 years. And I started during a time when I was dealing with clinical anxiety and depression and panic disorder. My panic disorder had blown up into agoraphobia. So I was unable to leave the house. I was on disability. And I was fortunate enough to be paired up with a psychologist who, even back in 1998, was several decades deep into practicing and teaching mindfulness and insight meditation. And no one was more surprised than me when that ended up starting a brand new chapter in my life. And almost 25 years later, here I am, practicing daily, teaching, still learning from myself, for sure. And here we are. Thanks so much for joining me. This is the next in the ongoing series of Calming Anxiety by Living Mindfully, where I like to share some of the techniques that others have shown me, techniques that I've discovered for myself, techniques I still use to this day, in the interest of being able to help other people who might be dealing with some of the kinds of things that I've dealt with. And it doesn't have to be a raging panic disorder. It can even be something like just your day-to-day stress, day-to-day anxiety. So whatever you have brought with you today for our sitting, let's jump in and work with it and see where it goes. Okay? I always like to begin my sitting by imagining that I am suspended from the ceiling by a piece of string attached to the top of my head, as a nice cue to sit up straight without adding any extra tension to do so. If there is some tension right now, mentally, physically, emotionally, that's completely fine. Completely fine. Very often we try to get rid of our tension and try to do so forcefully, which is really just adding tension to the tension that's already there, thinking that that's somehow going to result in less tension. Right? Doesn't make much sense when we think of it that way, does it? So if there is some tension, we can allow it to be tension. We can allow it to process. We can allow it to leave in its own time, which may or may not be today. I also like to notice what is beneath me. Chair, cushion, floor. Something is supporting me, holding me up. And I can allow it to do so. Let's take a moment to notice this grounding, this support beneath us, and this suspension from the ceiling above us. And whatever else happens to be in between the two for us right now, however it is. And if you haven't already, you may begin to bring your attention to your breathing. And very often, as soon as we bring our attention to our breathing, our tendency is to try to shape or control how the breathing is coming in, perhaps how it's going out. We don't have to do that here. There is no breath requirement for our meditation, other than simply noticing it as it is, long or short, deep or shallow. Changing, unchanging, even pleasant or unpleasant. It's enough to simply notice how it is on its own. And in fact, it can be quite challenging just to notice how it is on its own. And if you find that you are accustomed to controlling or shaping the breathing so much that you might not even be sure how to stop, then just notice that as part of the process. Oh, here's the controlling. Here's the shaping. There's no need to try to control the controlling, the same way we don't want to bring tension to tension. Now, in the first sitting I ever did by myself, I was really struck how when I simply observed, stopped trying to do anything and simply watch what was happening, I was really struck by this overwhelming exhaustion that I felt from my anxiety. And this was not new. This was not a surprise. I'd been feeling it for months. But what was surprising was that I suddenly saw the source of much of that exhaustion. I saw how much I was fighting myself. I was imagining that there was this part of me that was the anxiety and panic part. But then there was this other part of me that felt that the anxiety and panic part was unacceptable and needed to be stamped out. And then there was almost like there was a third part of me. What I was identifying with is, the real me. The objective me. That was agreeing with that second part of me. That the first part of me, the anxiety and panic part of me, needed to be stamped out. So I kind of had three me's, with two of them ganging up against this other one. And this civil war had been going on for years. And look where it had landed me. Agoraphobic, housebound, on disability. Clearly wasn't a very sustainable strategy. Not a very effective strategy. Not a very pleasant strategy. And that's when the first insight I ever had in this practice hit me, which was, if you fight yourself, you've already lost. It's not that we don't work to improve our skills, like our skills in mindfulness, insight meditation. But how are we going about it? Are we doing it in a sustainable, compassionate, and effective manner? Or are we engaging in aggression against ourselves? It's a well-intentioned aggression, in a sense. We're trying to improve, right? It's just not skillful, not sustainable, ultimately not even effective. So I try to notice at multiple levels. Where am I fighting myself? We can notice this just in the breathing. Am I fighting my breathing? Am I demanding it be a certain way? Or can I just allow it to flow as it is? I mean, our bodies know how to breathe. Can take care of it. I don't have to do anything. Sometimes I think of it as outsourcing the breathing. I'm outsourcing the breathing to the body. The body can take care of it. I can just watch. Notice if there's any tension in the breathing. If there's any tension in the body. And again, if there's tension in the body, that's fine. What are we doing with it though? Are we trying to get rid of it? Are we trying to force it away? Are we fighting with it? Are we identifying that part of us that has tension as not being really us, and then there's another us that's saying, okay, that us has to be different, be gone? What if we don't do that? What if we allow the breathing to be the breathing and allow tension to be tension? What do these processes do when we don't try to change them? You may bring this kind of open awareness, what's sometimes called a choiceless awareness, to feelings, to thoughts, various kinds of bodily sensations. We might begin to notice how they affect each other, play off of each other, how they interact with the breathing, which in itself we know as another bodily sensation. Just like with the separate selves I was talking about, we think of all of these processes, these sensations, these feelings, these thoughts, as being these separate things. Are they? Are they really separate and distinct? Or are they just interrelated components of one thing? I mean, we have a tendency to divide them up, but what are we using to divide them up? The mind. Does the mind always interpret reality accurately? Does the mind ever interpret reality accurately? What if we engage in a little more attention and a little less interpretation? As you go throughout your day, I invite you to notice where there might be some struggle. Struggling against what you're feeling. Perhaps struggling against what you think you might feel. After all, when we worry about what we might feel at some point, that in itself is something we're feeling now, isn't it? So that's still something we can observe here and now. Notice if there's a struggle in the here and now. And notice what happens if we don't interfere. We don't try to stop the struggle because that's struggling with the struggler, right? What happens if we simply notice the struggling as a process and give it all the room it wants to be a struggle? But without adding anything to it or trying to take anything away from it. Simply shining the light of attention on a process. In my experience, can often be more than enough. And when we don't interfere, we have the opportunity to be surprised at what we might find. Thank you, everyone. I will be hanging on here for a few minutes and we'll grab a look at the chat if anyone would like to share any observations, ask any questions. Yeah, Farna has the hopelessness, lack of energy. Yeah, the way I often describe my memories of clinical anxiety and depression days, not that I don't still have my times now, but particularly in those early days, it was like a weighted blanket. It was like trying to move under a weighted blanket. And what was really weird about it that I remember was how I simultaneously felt so heavy and weighed down, like I was covered in lead, but at the same time also felt weightless and ungrounded. Which is one of the reasons I start my sittings with the grounding bit. Okay, what's underneath me? At least have some sensation, like, okay, something is beneath me. Now, clearly I'm situated on something here. So even if I don't feel grounded, there is clearly something supporting me. That may not feel the way I necessarily would like, the way that I think it should, but it's still there. It's still there. Kind of goes back to that mind interpretation bit. Our mind is interpreting things, but is it interpreting accurately? I feel like I'm ungrounded, but am I really? Well, literally, physically, no. still subject to gravity here, right? And that gets back to the heart of this struggle, this fight, is like, well, I want to feel that way. And it's in the struggle to try to feel the way that we want to feel instead of the way that we do feel. That's where I was finding so much of my exhaustion coming from. I was experiencing significant discomfort. But the more I fought against that discomfort, the worse I was making things. So I deeply resonate with what you're saying there. It becomes a real vicious cycle, especially when we're feeling, and Ren's saying it here too, a lack of energy. And when we struggle against that, we're expending the energy we do have, trying to change the feeling of this other energetic experience. And this again is that civil war. Is it a good use of our energy to use some of our energy to try to fight with other energy, including energy that feels like a lack of energy? That's an interesting thing that I found is, and again, that mind interpretation. I found that even when I feel like there's a lack of energy, even that has, when I really open up to it, I feel, wow, there's an energetic sense to this as well. There's this sort of buzzing, this flowing, even to what I interpret as a lack of energy, which isn't to say that we don't sometimes have a lack of energy. But sometimes I will mentally interpret a feeling of energy that I find unpleasant, or a feeling of energy that is not the way I expect it to feel. I will misinterpret that as being a lack of energy. Not because I don't have energy, but because I have this type of energy that doesn't feel the way I expected, the way that I wanted. So is there really a lack of energy? Maybe. Maybe not. But we won't be able to discern what we're really working with here until we stop fighting with it and check it out a little. That way we can get a better idea. Okay, what's really going on here? We can sharpen our skills of interpretation. Chris, overthinking causes exhaustion. Yeah, done it. So what I always say about overthinking, if we are overthinking about something or some things, in my experience, that almost invariably means that we are trying not to feel something. Which, again, is that civil war. We're trying to think our way out of something. We're trying to intellectualize something away. Does it work? Nah. Our intellectual systems, evolutionarily, came after our felt systems, our feelings. And the older systems, they always override. That's why we can never think our way out of feeling something. It doesn't work that way. We need to go into the felt sense and let that process. So anytime I start overthinking something, which is a lot, right? Okay. What am I trying not to feel here? What am I avoiding? What am I struggling against? What's my civil war over? Oh, you like the, Chris, again, the outsourcing the breathing to the body. I'm glad you like that. That's one of mine. I'm sure I'm not the first person to ever come up with that, but that's one I came up with on my own, was this feeling of outsourcing. I found that to be a nice way of thinking of, okay, I don't have to deal with this. I don't have to do anything with this. The body can take care of this. I mean, if the body couldn't take care of breathing, we'd be screwed every time we fell asleep, right? So we don't have to do anything for the breathing. And in fact, in my experience, I'm typically better off if I don't try to do anything with the breathing. We can. There are breathing exercises. I'm nothing against them. You may find it more helpful to use breathing exercises and deliberately control the breathing. That has not been my personal experience. And I teach from my own personal experience. That's all I can really do. That's all any of us can really do. So, yeah, this thought of outsourcing the breathing, take it right off the plate. I don't have to do a damn thing. I can just see what you're doing. Here, body, you handle it. And I'll just see what you do. Hell, I'm curious. Let's see what you do with it. So I'm glad that resonated for you. Leanne, find the sensations hard to handle. Yeah. Sensations, it's that energy. It's that this isn't what I want to be feeling, or it's not feeling the way I expect it to be feeling. When I was first starting my practice, it was after 8 years of avoiding panic disorder. And I had a fear of panic disorder. So it was a hell of a vicious cycle. And what I was terrified of were the sensations of panic. The quickened breathing. So I hypervigilantly controlled my breathing for 8 years because I didn't want to get too fast. Because that was that first sign of, could be a panic attack. Which is why I found it so powerful. Scary at first, terrifying, but powerful when I started this practice and stopped trying to control the breathing. It's like, oh, holy crap, I can let the breathing be and just watch what happens. I can watch the heart rate fluctuate and just see what happens. I can experience shaking, sweating, tingling, all kinds of sensations. Not even just bodily sensations, mind sensations, the tunnel vision, and the head swirls that would come with panic. Could experience those sensations, those processes. And kind of like I was saying, we tend to think of the mind, the body, the feelings as being separate. Are they separate? Or are they just interrelated components of the same thing? Same thing here with the panic processes. Interrelated components of the same thing. But I can bring attention to each component individually and then begin to see how they interrelate, how they affect each other, how my interpretation of them affects them. Because as I made my way through working with panic disorder, what was changing? Was it the sensations? Well, no. Quickened breathing, quickened heart rate, shaking, sweating, head swirls. These are all basically the same as they ever were. What's changed? My interpretation. My recognition that these may be uncomfortable, these may be unpleasant. Are they actually unsafe? Well, for a long time I thought, oh yeah, this is not safe. Is it actually unsafe? Experience didn't bear that out, because those sensations would come and go. Panic would arise and pass. What changed was how much I was interfering with it. And what were the results I was getting from that interference? It was making things worse, a lot worse. And perpetuating this cycle of fear, uncertainty, unfamiliarity. Simply because I was experiencing sensations that were not as I wanted them, or sensations I did not want at all. And we don't have a choice about that sometimes. We live in these bodies, on this planet, in this atmosphere. We're going to experience sensations we might find unpleasant. How we deal with that reality has a huge effect on what kind of experience we have in our lives. I found out the hard way that it is much more sustainable much more effective to open up to these things when they arise, rather than engage in a civil war every time they present themselves. And Michelle, if not intertwined, then at least overlapping thoughts, feeling, bodily sensations, all this stuff. They're interrelated components of the same process. They're all part of one thing. Doesn't mean we can't, again, pay attention to them individually. We can break them down. We run into trouble when we think they're isolated incidents. Nothing happens in a vacuum. And Chris, you like the mind interpret accurately. Yeah. I've been doing a lot of reading in Zen lately, and it talks about how we divide things up in the mind. This term Maya, division, categorization. And it's how we make sense of things. Our minds interpret things in a linear manner. This to this to this to this to this. The world does not operate in a linear manner. So we have a mind that is trying to interpret a world in a way that the world isn't. It's trying to make sense of something that does not operate in the same way that it interprets its operations. What does this mean? It means there's a lot of distortion there. There's a lot of misinformation. So we want to practice clear seeing, which is what we're doing in mindfulness and insight meditation, so that we can hone our skills of interpretation. We're never going to see reality as it actually is, but we can improve so that we're making our decisions in life based on the best information we can, the best information we can get. Leanne, how do we cope with the fear of anxiety? Nearly everything that I teach has to do with fear and anxiety in one way or another. Like I say, I teach from my experience, and that's the bulk of what brought me to this practice, the overwhelming bulk of what brought me to this practice. So that's a theme that runs throughout my sessions. Even when I'm talking about things like acceptance, it's still in the anxiety theme, if you will. You know, there's this saying that everything we do comes from either a place of love or a place of fear. That's something I didn't buy into for a very long time. And the more I practice and the more I teach and the more I learn, I find it harder and harder to argue with that sentiment. There's no one answer of how we deal with not just anxiety, not just with fear, but fear of anxiety, which again is exactly what brought me to this practice, was fear of panic disorder, panic of panic. You know, kind of the mother of all vicious cycles, I guess. So check out some of that stuff and feel free to drop me a line if you'd like to talk a little further. I do private sessions as well. I mean, there's all kinds of options. We can talk more if you like. Chris, the breathing techniques. I've dabbled with a lot of breathing techniques. I've never really gotten a whole lot out of them. The only thing that I really use regularly when I practice yoga, I do ujjayi breathing, a special kind of deep breathing we do in yoga. That I do when I'm doing my yoga practice. Other than that, I've dabbled with breathing techniques. For me, nothing has really ever worked better than simply letting the breathing be as it is. And I do think a lot of that has to do with the number of years when I was dealing with panic that I would not allow the breathing to be as it was. And it was just such a different experience. And again, it was very scary at first, but it was also then very liberating to just let the breathing be as it is. And after 24 years of that, I still find that to be the most effective for me. Other people may find otherwise, and by all means, do what works for you. I often quote an American monk on here, Thanissaro Bhikkhu. He's the teacher that I read and study by far the most. And he advocates working with different kinds of breathing techniques. So one way is not better than another. You need to find what works for you, and what works for you will change over time as well. Chris, so you say right there, just leave it alone. Yeah. And a lot of people really appreciate that. I found in my teaching, a lot of people are relieved when I say, yeah, you don't have to control the breathing. Well, I don't have to control the breathing? It's like, no. And in fact, the challenge then becomes, yeah, go ahead and try not to. As we continue practicing, even when we don't control the breathing, we start to notice, oh, I thought I wasn't controlling the breathing anymore, but I'm starting to notice at a more subtle level, there's still some controlling happening here. Oh, interesting. It's kind of like I said at the end of the sitting. Shining the light of attention is enough to open us to be surprised at what we might find. And that's one of those surprises sometimes. Oh, yeah, I practiced without controlling the breathing. Well, do you really? Oh, wow. Huh. I just spotted that. Well, maybe not. Then we just notice that. Don't struggle against it. Oh, look at that. Because if we had struggled against it before, we never would have noticed it this subtle level now. We'd still be at that grosser level above, right? It's amazing how this stuff will just unfold and unravel on its own if we just let it. We just give it the space to do so. From Ren, can I do a session about how to handle panic attack, especially in public? Let me think about that. How I would go about that. I can certainly talk about, and I do sometimes talk about, some of the more intellectual, the theoretical ways of working with it. It becomes a little difficult when it comes to applying that in an actual sitting, because I don't want us to try to generate feelings of panic in a sitting. That's why when we go through these sittings, like what we did today, this applies. This applies. This kind of opening up, even though it seems counterintuitive, in my experience, when I open up to the sensations, including sensations of panic, especially sensations of panic, which may not even be indicating an actual panic attack. It could be my misinterpretation because a particular kind of energy doesn't feel the way I want it to or expect it to. That's the kind of stuff that would once lead me to panic. Like, oh, this is an unacceptable feeling. Is it? Or is it just unpleasant? Big difference between unpleasant and unacceptable, just like unpleasant and unsafe. I had a huge breakthrough with panic in public in my early days when, for the very first time, when I started feeling the sensations of a panic attack in public, after I had completely crashed and burned and was housebound and started getting out of the house again, I was in a public place and felt the sensations of panic start and realized that I couldn't get away fast enough. At this point, I'd been practicing, I don't know, maybe 6 or 8 weeks, and had gotten just accustomed enough to opening to the breathing as it was, starting to open to sensations as they were. And I realized, if I have a panic attack right here, right now, I can't get away. It's going to happen. And in that moment, I was just like, well, if it's going to happen, then let's just go ahead and do it. I don't have a choice anyway. So, okay, go ahead. Go ahead. Do it. And almost instantly, I felt like 30 pounds had dropped from me. And my whole body just relaxed. And everything settled. And I was like, the hell just happened? And that was when that initial insight I had had maybe 2 months earlier about if you fight yourself, you've already lost, really got driven home. Because I found that in this civil war I'd been engaging in with myself, well, I kept showing up with my weapons looking for a fight, and I was getting one. What happened when I stopped fighting? Well, so did the other side. And of course, because the other side was me too. There's this funny old quote that says the quickest way to end a war is to lose it. In a sense, I surrendered in that moment. And because both sides were me, both sides surrendered. And there was no fight. And it was the fight that was perpetuating the panic. I think it was last week I did a session talking about how fear is a cloud. That's kind of what I'm talking about. It was this mirage. It's not that there weren't necessarily some sensations. Of course, the sensations existed, the thoughts existed, the feelings existed, but from what? Where were they coming from? What was I doing with them? And what was I generating by what I was doing with them? So, I will sometimes have an accelerated heart rate, accelerated breathing, various other sensations that might be associated with panic. To this day. Have those sensations changed from the way they've ever been? No. An accelerated heart rate is an accelerated heart rate. What's changed? My interpretation. My willingness to experience the process as it is. What happens when I stop interfering with it? Oh, it processes. Because that's what processes do. They process. And then what happens? Oh, eventually it goes away. Would it have eventually gone away if I kept fighting with it? Yeah, at some point, I guess. It always did. But it took a hell of a lot longer. And it was a much worse experience. And at some point, would happen again anyway. So counterintuitively, I found that the willingness to experience, it kind of goes back to the overthinking thing again. Anytime we're overthinking, we're trying not to feel something. What was I overthinking about? Not having a panic attack. Why? Because I didn't want to feel a panic attack. And what was happening as a result? I was feeling a lot of panic attacks. Let's maybe change something here. Only took me 8 years and a total collapse to figure it out. You know? Funny thing about humans, we always do the right thing once we've exhausted all other options. Right? That's why I practice a session like this. Practicing this openness. What I was practicing with you here today is effectively what I was doing. Working with panic in public. Wow, we are running way over today, which is fine with it. I'll go all day if I could. Unfortunately, of course, I can't. But let's grab one or two more, and then we'll have to wrap up. Yeah, Debbie, I'd wanted to hear the last few sentences of your talk. I think where I was wrapping up was with the mind interpretation bit. Noticing what is coming up. Noticing our interpretation of it and seeing if we can bring our attention to it. A little more attention, a little less interpretation. We can't stop interpretation. I mean, so much of that happens subconsciously. So again, we're not fighting with interpretation. Just noticing. Am I seeing this thing as it is? Or am I seeing it through the lens of what I want, what I don't want, my memories, my fears? And again, we can't totally stop that, but we can see a little bit more to what extent those things are coloring our interpretation and our experience and what we're doing with that. Again, like me with panic in a public place. Okay, I'm experiencing an accelerated heart rate. Okay. I could interpret that any number of ways that are not going to end well, simply because of the interpretation itself. Or I can bring attention to it and say, oh, accelerated heart rate. Okay. Let's see what that's about. Maybe not something I expected. Maybe not something I wanted. May not be comfortable. You can check it out, though. Still me. Yeah, pain is wanting to be heard, not swept aside or put out of the mind. That's just it. Pain's a process. Everything that we're talking about here is a process. And in my experience, letting processes process, even if they're not the processes we necessarily wanted or ordered off the menu, tends to be the best way for avoiding suffering, right? Which is what the Buddha taught. How do we avoid suffering? We may experience some painful sensations, uncomfortable sensations, like those of panic, anxiety. But what are we doing with them? How are we interpreting them? How are we acting on those interpretations? And how are those actions informing our future interpretations? To what extent are we getting in our own way? Are we taking pain and discomfort and creating suffering? Creating suffering in an attempt to never feel pain or discomfort again, which, good luck, doesn't work that way. Not skillful, not effective. I think I'll wrap it up there. But this was really great. It's great to see so much activity in the chat. Have a great rest of your day or evening. And I hope to see you all again real soon. Cheers, everyone. Take care.